Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. My name is Ben Wilder, Director of the Desert Laboratory on Tumamoc Hill, and this is our spring lecture series, Planting the Seeds for Tomorrow, the Tumamoc Resilience Garden. I am speaking to you right now from Tumamoc Hill, known in O'odham as Tumamoc Duag, Horned Lizard Mountain, on the ancestral lands of the Savipri and O'odham peoples. This volcanic hill is of prominent ancestral, cultural, and sacred significance to the O'odham nations, including the O'odham Nation, Gila River Indian Community, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, and the Akchin Indian Community, as well as the Hopi tribe and the Pasco Yaqui tribe. The Desert Laboratory recognizes the cultural significance of Tumamoc Duag as the bedrock of our institution and our future actions. This lecture series is really all about celebrating the creation of an inspiration for the new Tumamoc Resilience Garden at the base of the hill. We are really diving into not just the inspiration of what we're trying to create in this new garden space, but also going to be bringing to you the creators from the conceptual elements that we're talking about today to the really physical mechanisms we're using to bring water down to the space through landscape practices and water harvesting practices, as well as a lot of the cultural knowledge that we're inspired by, the broader reaches across arid regions throughout the world, and then also looking towards the next generation. Each one of those themes I just mentioned to you is one of the 5 lectures that we're going to be bringing to you throughout this spring. First, there's a number of reasons why this is a very strong space to be talking and thinking about food resilience. In addition to Tumamoc being a community gathering space where we can educate the broader public about future of life in the desert, this is also a space with a long history of adaptations and food history. Tumamoc has long been a place to learn from desert resources. For example, the oldest archaeological date we have for the site, 2,500 years ago, is based on a corn kernel from the top of the hill, co-located with the trincheras rock walls that surround the site. Likewise, we have the agave field from the Hohokam times, about 1,500 years ago. That is one of the best examples of arid landscape technology and rainwater harvesting modifications to create a slow agricultural product, agave, for arid region. And fast forwarding to more modern times, much of the research that's been focused at the Desert Laboratory, including work pioneered by Howard Scott Gentry, has been looking not just locally, but really at the broad scale around the world for species that make sense for arid adapted agriculture. Second, one of the core concepts in desert ecology, the nurse tree concept, is really kind of fundamental to desert ecology, which was pioneered here at the Desert Laboratory. We're going to be talking a lot more in this lecture series about the nurse tree concept and the microclimate, as well as the soil resources and this very kind of ecosystem way of thinking about co-locating food plants with under overstories of shade of trees that really connects to some larger principles of desert ecology that are part and parcel with the history of the Desert Laboratory. I can't really think of a better way to kick off this lecture series than our speakers today, Dr. Erin Riordan and Dr. Gary Nabhan, who really have in large part conceived and especially articulated the broader model that is the driver behind the Tumamoc Resilience Garden. So thank you for joining us. And at this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Erin Riordan, who is a research scientist associated with the University of Arizona, including the Desert Laboratory and the Southwest Center. Erin's broad research background includes applied sciences using species distribution model and working with land managers in California and Arizona, and now with a special focus on using that applied sciences, but thinking about our food systems and sustainability in the local as well as regional system. Erin, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Wow, well, thank you so much, Ben. That's a fantastic introduction. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here and kick us off. So as Ben mentioned, this is really a fantastic place to be addressing issues of arid land, food security, and agriculture. And it's a real pleasure today to talk about the motivations for this larger project, which is the Desert Labs Aridamerica Food Resilience Research Initiative. And among that, or within that, is the Tumamoc Resilience Gardens. So we're really trying to envision a new framework for arid land food production that's going to help us create more resilience to these climate disruptions that we're seeing, while also benefiting land health and human health and helping restore rural economies and well-being in our desert communities. So I'm going to provide some context to this project, and then I will pass the reins over to Gary to really dive deeper into the nuts and bolts of what we see for a new vision of arid land food production and where we're going with the gardens at the base of the hill. A big motivator for this work is our current climate crisis. Despite a wet monsoon that we've had here in Arizona and some winter rainfall that we're getting along the West Coast, we're still in the midst of a very severe drought. And so this map that I'm showing on the screen right here, this is from this month, and it's looking at the drought intensity across the continental US. And we can see that all of the West is still in some form of drought, with the darkest red colors being the most severe drought. It's actually, well into 20 to 22 years of drought in the West. And, in Arizona and in the desert, we're no strangers to hot temperatures and low rainfall and periods of drought, but really with climate change, we're kicking it up to the next level. And these increases in temperatures are really exacerbating the drought that we as humans experience, and also that our native ecosystems and our agricultural systems experience. And so when we really factor in the periods of low rainfall with warmer and warmer temperatures, we're seeing that, the type of drought that we're having right now is really a mega drought, and we haven't seen something intense as this for the last 1,200 or so years. And just, what we're looking at is over half of the continental lower 48 states is in some form of drought, and that's impacting a huge number of people. Almost 95 million people in the US are currently experiencing some form of drought conditions. And then we have about, 194 million acres of crops in the US are currently experiencing drought conditions as of this week right now in January. If we zoom in on Arizona, I just wanted to again reiterate this context. What we can see here is a timeline starting in 2000 and going to our current year. And we can see the percent of the state that is in some sort of drought conditions. And just take a look at the last couple of years, especially 2021, where we had really low rainfall and at the end of 2020, pretty much no monsoonal rain, and just had this incredibly severe drought. And I kind of think of it as a teaser of what we might expect to see in the future, is we're expecting to see these record-breaking temperatures, which we were feeling in the last couple of years, especially in the summer, record lows and precip. But then just this last summer, in 2021, we had a record-breaking monsoon season. So we're expecting to see this warming trend continue, this drying trend continue, but embedded within that, a whole lot of more variability and unpredictability, which can make it really challenging to grow food in the desert when we're really dealing with this high variability and high levels of extremes ping-ponging amidst, worsening drought conditions and dwindling water reserves. We're also seeing huge impacts of warming temperatures and climate change on human health. Certainly with respect to heat-related illnesses, we're seeing upticks in the number of people that are hospitalized due to heat, especially here in Arizona and in our warm Sonoran Desert. We're seeing increases in the number of heat-related deaths, but heat is also exacerbating certain chronic conditions, things like diabetes and high blood pressure, these kind of chronic health concerns are getting worsened by living in extreme conditions. On top of that, we think about the way that we are growing our food, which often is kind of at an industrialist scales where we're focusing at a single annual crop over a large area of land. These practices are really erosive to the landscape, and they are a huge contributor to greenhouse gases, which are exacerbating our warming temperatures. And so we can see from this figure right here that it's just over a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions are actually coming from the way that we produce our food. And here in the arid West, we are producing food in a way that's not sustainable with respect to water. We simply don't have the water stores and then the water input that can support the types of ways that we're growing annual crops. We can also see that it has a huge impact on our natural resources, on our fresh water, on our biodiversity. There's a lot of pollution. So there's just huge impacts across the boards if we're going to continue growing the food in the way that we become accustomed to and over much of the United States. I want to mention too here that there's another health component that's not just related to climate change, but is really entangled with our food systems. That we have a lot of health-related illnesses that are related to nutrition and diet. And so here we can see high blood pressure, high blood sugar, obesity, dietary issues that are all contributing. This is a worldwide factor, a worldwide scale to deaths. And we can again zoom in on Arizona and think about issues of food security. And we can see not only do we have issues related to health and our diets and food systems, but we also have a huge challenge with food insecurity, especially in the parts of our community that are less affluent. And so, where do we go from here? If we continue as we're going, growing conventional crops in really large-scale agricultural settings, this simply is not going to be sustainable as temperatures rise and droughts deepen and our water resources dwindle. We're already seeing that temperatures are exceeding some of the thresholds that certain crops have to be productive to flower and fruit. And temperatures are only rising. So what is it actually going to look like for us to feed ourselves and thrive, not just get by, but thrive in a hotter and drier future? Now, all of what I just said can seem a bit dire and doom and gloom, but I want to take a step back and acknowledge that where we are right now is the perfect place to be tackling just this sort of question. It's our backyard where we can come up with the solutions to how to cope with a warmer and drier world, because we live in the Sonoran Desert. We have a deep human history here. We have plants that have been used as food for millennia that are really well adapted to extreme conditions, too hot temperatures, too long periods of droughts. So really, all of the materials that we need to come up with the solutions are here in our very own backyard. And we can think of our arid lands as kind of these laboratories for the future of figuring out how are we going to live more resilient, healthy, productive lives as temperatures rise. I'm going to use the term Aridamerica, and here I want to just show a map of what that means. We can see outlines in the orange. We can see the Sonoran Desert is really at the heart of Aridamerica, and this is just our North American drylands. And we have an incredible amount of biodiversity in our North American drylands, and in particular in the Sonoran Desert, where we have kind of this bimodal rainfall distribution. We have winter rains, and we have plants that are adapted to really take advantage of that. We have summer rains and plants that are adapted to take advantage of the moisture that comes during the warmer part of the year. And then we have a whole suite of plants that are adapted to really handle periods of high heat and low water, of high drought stress, and really weather years of multiple years of drought conditions. And I really think that a big motivator for this work, and I can think of no better way to kind of sum it up, is this quote from the late great Richard Felger, which is fit the crop to the lands, not the lands to the crop. And so really, what can we do to take advantage of kind of the native biodiversity that we have here in our Sonoran Desert, to think about in a new way types of foods that we could more sustainably grow with low water. And just a couple of examples here are our succulent cacti like cholla, like prickly pears. They're really these great endurers that can handle multiple years of adverse climate conditions. You can contrast that with species like amaranth that really take advantage of high rainfall summer seasons. And then also we can think about mesquites. Here's another desert plant that is really well adapted to harsh conditions. It has really deep roots that are able to tap down to more long-term perennial water sources. And even the leaves in and of itself on the tree, these really small leaves, they're actually an adaptation to deal with heat. The smaller the leaf, the less surface area to absorb that heat from the sun. And so just by having small leaves, like many desert plants do, you can help moderate some of your temperatures and cope with these conditions. And so that's just a small handful of the types of ecological adaptations that our desert systems have. And that's really a big motivator when we're trying to think about ways that we could creatively come up with a new framework for what food looks like and how it looks to grow food. I'm gonna just briefly give a few examples here. So here we can see a nurse plant guild, and this is a type of ecological adaptation to cope with the extreme conditions that we have. I'll let Gary dive into this a little bit more, but here's a whole system of plants growing together in a mutualistic way that is really a tool that we're looking to for trying to think about how to grow plants in our arid America in a more sustainable way. And then we have these two contrasting strategies that I mentioned before. We have agaves, which are really embody this idea of slow food and a plant that it can endure years and years of harsh conditions, contrasted with another plant here, amaranth, that can really handle the booms and busts that we're expecting to see more of, these periods of really intense rainfall that we will continue to have and may have in extreme conditions. And so this brings me to kind of the fundamental question here, motivating the work, and that is, can we envision a new model of food production based on the ecological adaptations and the indigenous knowledge of our deserts that promotes the resiliency of our lands and communities to climatic, health, and economic stressors? No. Ben mentioned it at the start of this lecture series, but I think it warrants another mention, and that is, we are truly in one of the best places to tackle that question. Here at the heart of Aridamerica in the Sonoran Desert, we have an incredible human history of perseverance and resilience, of agriculture in the area that dates back for millennia, for 4,000 or so years. And we can see that in the archaeological sites that we have around Tucson, and we can see it again at Tumamoc Hill at the base of the hill at the agave flats, where we can still see the rock terraces and rock piles that were used to help cultivate agaves on Tumamoc Hill. Now, it's these pieces that Gary and our incredible team of collaborators here had in mind when we came together to try to develop this conceptual model of what does it look like to grow food sustainably in a hotter, drier world, and what are the key elements of our desert systems that we can really run with to envision a new world of sustainable food production. And with that, Gary, I'd love to pass the reins to you to talk a bit more about the details and nuts and bolts.
Well, thank you. Let me get my video on. It's great to be with you. And at the very start, I want to thank our wonderful team that Ben has pulled together at Tumamoc Hill for this project, not only Erin and Ben and Anna, who are managing the rollout of this garden, but our incredibly gifted hero of water harvesting in the entire world, Brad Lancaster, and a dozen other people who've been involved in the planning of these efforts. And what we're really talking about in ways is listening to the past, the evolution of desert adaptations in plants and animals and in plant guilds like the one Ben and Erin mentioned, the ironwood columnar cactus plant guild. But we're also paying attention to the indigenous knowledge, but in this case, we're not using any indigenous domesticated crop seeds to roll this out. We're really talking about reverse engineering agriculture overall in the desert. For the last 5,000 years, we've drawn upon primarily structural and compositional elements of agriculture from other regions and other climates, the Mesoamerican corn that came in 5,000 years ago. We didn't have anything like corn as a wild plant in Arizona before that. The introduction of wonderful fruit trees and grains from the old world that came in with the Spanish. We're sort of sidestepping those for the moment to look at an entirely new idea. What can we learn from the Sonoran Desert structure, composition, and function that would create an agricultural site that supports resilient lands and people? And in particularly, we're designing it with 3 goals in mind that are seldom, if ever, united in designing agricultural systems. Assuring that there's ecosystem health, that we're not depleting the soils or water reserves within the soil and below it. Human health, including that, most importantly, of the farm workers who are now the most at risk in bringing us our daily bread of any people in our food system. They're facing the brunt of climate change. And third, community well-being. If we don't create livelihoods with livable wages for everyone in the food supply chain, it doesn't matter whether we have a good crop or a good tasting meal, we still have a bankrupt community. So with that start, I want to go to the next image and look at how we're using that concept of biomimicry that people came up with about 20 years ago and freshly applying it to be an inspiration for crop cultivation. We're really going back to the core knowledge that's been developed over the last 100 years on Tumamoc Hill, beginning with forestry, of how desert ecosystems organize themselves in beneficial mutualisms to reduce the stress and deal with the scarcities that might otherwise be in the environment. And so in this case, the nurse plant, which is a Palo Verde, is providing not only a canopy of shade that reduces the heat and the solar radiation for all the other plants under it, but it is also reducing freeze damage in the winter and enriching the soil not only with more organic matter from the leaf fall, but is serving as a harbor for mycorrhizae that all the other plants you see in that photo share, which not only helps them grow quicker and uptake more nutrients, but it protects them from many plant diseases. So that's why the nurse plant guild that we're talking about is the functional unit. We're not talking about a miracle crop or a miracle health food. We're talking about a complex agricultural ecosystem based on the inherent complexity of these Sonoran Desert nurse plant guilds. Next image, please. So this is the idea of biomimicry that Jeanette Banyas came up with 20 years ago or so. We look intensively at the structure, function, and composition of these desert nurse plant guilds right out our windows at Tumamoc Hill and right out the windows of many of you who live in Tucson or other parts of the Sonoran Desert. And then we use their structural benefits that create these mutualisms between a number of plants to drive the design of it. In this case, to design a desert perennial polyculture. Now, we've been using a lot of big words like agroecosystems and perennial polycultures, the same way many permaculture activists use them. But we've coined a new word for what we're doing here. We're aiming for a slow agriculture, one where plants like prickly pear and agaves may take 20 years or more, up to 30, 35 to be harvested. But that yield stability after the first harvest goes on for a century or more, that we accumulate soil nutrients and soil microbes, that we accumulate understory plants that are also food plants, that we increasingly create an agricultural ecosystem that is not only more resilient to stresses, but more self-generating. And that's a key difference between the agriculture that we see out on hundreds of millions of acres in California, Arizona, and New Mexico in desert climates, and what we want in the future. We want that self-generation. We don't want all the crops to be plowed up at the end of October and something planted anew. Next image, please. Because of that, future desert food production simply will not look like, nor will its products taste like what we are used to here in Arizona today, even though they may be more like what people living 5,000 to 10,000 years ago in the Sonoran Desert actually drew upon for their sustenance. Here's that wonderful chaos of what indigenous knowledge matched with a great diversity of plants that are native to arid and semi-arid areas do when we let them loose to do what they're best at. And this is in a rain shadow area of Jalisco, where we see agaves, columnar cacti, prickly pear, leguminous trees like mesquite and huisache and other desert legumes, all intercropped, not in rows, but in ways where they have higher probabilities of providing mutualistic benefits to one another. Now, this simply does not look like agriculture to any current Arizona farmer, but we are not trying to rely simply on business as usual in Arizona. We're trying to establish a new vision for this slow agriculture that does not deplete the resources it's based on, but regenerates them. Next image. Ironically, those nurse plant guilds have a very interesting structural analog in the kinds of wonderful work that Greg Barron-Gafford and his dozen-some collaborators are doing at Biosphere 2 on agrivoltaics. And that's why I want to say that this is not cultural appropriation at all. This is being inspired by what's happened from the past, but taking it in new, unforeseen directions. And agrivoltaics is one of those. The solar panels function structurally like the desert legumes of ironwood and mesquite and palo verde do. But they're also generating renewable energy and shedding water that is then stored and placed on the plants below them. The plants around and beneath the solar panels actually increase their efficiency in generating renewable energy, because almost everywhere that solar panels are placed in the desert today, they're at their temperature threshold for maximum returns of renewable energy on what they can produce, given the wear and tear of heat on the panels and simply the optimal efficiency of the panels' photovoltaic apparatuses themselves. So this co-location of water, energy, and food brings multiple benefits and multiple income streams to farmers. Next image. If we take a step back from just what could be on the floodplain with solar panels for agrivoltaics, a concept that Paul Maroka and Dick Felger and I started playing around with 40 years ago, by the way, we see that we can use that solar energy to pump water to storage tanks up at the very top of the terrain that we're putting these systems in, so that it can be drip irrigated, or better, use highly efficient micro aspersion irrigation technologies to bring water directly to the roots of columnar cacti, shrubs like huisache and ironwood and mesquite that we call trees, but in other places they're called short stature trees, as well as wonderful shrubs like wolfberry and hackberry and elderberry. Under the collectors, we use herbaceous perennials, and when there's a lot of water, we can intercrop more water consumptive annuals that have short cycles, like the grain amaranth that Erin mentioned, and so that we really fill the available arable space at capacity on the basis of the water moisture availability at any given time. Next image. Now, this is an overview of how we look at those three drivers of change: the stresses on food crops, the stresses on human health, and the economic stresses on rural and now urban economies because of climate change. We redesign our agroecosystems to reduce the impacts, the negative impacts of those stressors like heat and drought and salinity, and select technologies and plants that already have adaptations to dealing with these stresses. And we end up with resilient crops of many growth forms, not just grains or beans, but ones that can be produced with a minimum of fossil groundwater and fossil fuel. We grow crops that do not just provide us with our calories and protein, but many secondary chemicals that are chemopreventative, that literally are in the plants we're using to protect them from heat stress and drought stress. And the same volatile oils and other secondary compounds actually protect the human body from diseases like diabetes and cancer. And then we use diversified rural jobs, because some of these systems are still partially hand-picked, others mechanized. And we actually put more human eyes and hands back on the land in satisfying jobs in shaded conditions than we've seen in Arizona for over a century. Next image. Well, as I said, pioneers like Richard Felger and Howard Gentry have been working on elements of this kind of thing for over 40 years, but they were ahead of their curve. That farmers would say, we don't have any real need to stop irrigating 6 times a season for alfalfa because alfalfa is still making money for us. We really don't need to cut back on water, protect our crops from heat, because what we're growing now, we can grow during the cold season and harvest it before it gets hot. All of those excuses for not investing in a desert, slow agriculture have gone out the window in Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas within the last 5 years. And this year particularly, we see that Arizona is now suffering the worst water shortage in its recorded history. The county just north of us will lose $100 million of farm income and at least 500 jobs this year. And a county to the west of us, Cochise County, is having most farmers decline more into debt, and groundwater declines are increasing their production costs exponentially. So we have to look for solutions, and we have to have pilot projects that demonstrate to farmers that this is doable, viable, and economically efficient, that it will make them more money than business as usual. Next image. So this is the stage that we call planning the paper. After 40 years of Dr. Gentry and Dr. Felger and many other people in Mexico talking about these ideas for a new slow agriculture in the Sonoran Desert, we still don't have a single demonstration plot, a proof of concept of more than 2 acres anywhere in the desert. Brad Lancaster has a beautiful example in his yard. I have an agave, cactus, elderberry, mesquite, chiltepine, oregano, perennial polyculture with more than 50 kinds of agaves at my place at 4,000 feet. But we really need these in public places. And so March 8th through 10th, we'll be inaugurating the first Desert Smells Like Rain perennial polyculture garden for food at the Sonoran Desert Inn at the International Sonoran Desert Alliance's annual Sonoran Desert Symposium. It's in their courtyard, a place that Nina Sahovic and Sterling Johnson have farmed incredibly well over the last 10 years. But now we're using some unoccupied space to increase the number of perennial desert food plants there. So that will be the first one done, but within 2 months of it, it's the one where you see the 2 people kneeling and planting understory plants there to the left, and Susan Black's drawing. Susan's the landscape architect on that project. Within 2 months of that being completed, we'll see a similar kind of effort at the base of Tumamoc Hill that Brad Lancaster is really the landscape designer on, and I'm co-designer in selecting the crops and the associations of the guilds. And we'll be using water harvesting at both sites in varying degrees because of the annual rainfall at the 2 sites. Next image. We want to see the Tumamoc resilience gardens that will be multiple, some emphasizing fragrance plants, some emphasizing perennial succulents, some emphasizing the nurse plant guilds, others looking at the crop wild relatives. We want to see this suite of gardens be sort of like a very visible shopping centers of ideas for slow agriculture, that the 5,000 people who walk up Tumamoc each week can stop and not only smell the flowers, but see that there's food being produced by plants that are really all around them in Tucson, but have never been configured in a way that they can produce a steady yield perennial polyculture. Next image. This design by Brad shows the old shrine house that's still there. We've demolished another house that was at risk behind it. And that's where these nurse plant guilds will be fueled, in a sense, by the rainwater harvesting that Brad is now installing on both sides of the house to bring in as much captured rainwater to soak into the soil to support the entire suite of plants that we'll be planting there. And so there'll be rock mulches, there'll be swales, there'll be a number of other features to show people, even at the house yard level, how you can maximize the capture of rainwater in the soil, not just in cisterns around your house. Next image, please. You'll see here that we're using existing trees as well as bringing in slightly maturing saplings of mesquite, ironwood, columnar cacti, so that you can see this garden grow into the full structure and composition that we want over the next decade. Within a decade's time, this system will be at full tilt for food production. But we want to show that it's possible for any of you who live in Tucson or Phoenix or Ajo or Hermosillo who are listening to this, to do the same thing with gradual changes on your own land. Next image, please. Now, what about the food produced from this? Just as we need a slow agriculture, we need a slow gastronomy, even more than slow food promotes, because we want a diet that's based on these perennials that have yield stability over time and that have these secondary compounds and other nutraceutical benefits every time you eat them. So the nurse plants that provide the shade for all the understory food crops will be species that you know well, like the velvet mesquite, but will be not just using them for in the raw form, but fermenting them into probiotic beverages, like the one I'm drinking now that's a mesquite, pineapple, agave probiotic ferment. We'll be also fermenting the flour with yeast and bacteria to create something like injera or the wonderful chickpea crepes that you get around the Mediterranean, where the flour is actually fermented before you bake it. And a similar process has been used in the Sonoran communities. You can also make mesquite wine and mesquite beer and many other probiotic beverages by using the crack pods, like you would use a tabbouleh as a base, or the ground talcum-like flour of the pods to jumpstart the probiotic fermentation. And just like we want microbes in the soil around those nurse plant guilds, we want to reintroduce to Sonoran desert cuisines dozens, if not hundreds, of additional desert-adapted, heat-adapted food microbes. Next. Prickly pear, of course, many of you have eaten. You've eaten the syrups or fresh fruit of the tunas, or you've eaten the prepared pads we call nopalitos. These will be absolutely essential to reducing the rates of diabetes and other nutrition-related diseases that are exacerbated by climate stress and dehydration. So again, for hundreds of years, people have made a fermented probiotic beverage in the Sonoran Desert called colonche that sometimes has 12 to 15 yeast and bacteria happening as a sweet, as an entourage, to create something like a prickly pear kombucha. We're going to work with chefs and bakers and millers and and fermentation experts to raise the microbial diversity, not just the plant diversity of our diets. Next. And finally, the agave, which is really the iconic plant of slow agriculture. It may take 32 plants for an agave to flower and fruit for the first time, but sometimes maestros mezcaleros wait another 2 years to harvest it until all the fruits are up in the stalk and the heart of the plant. And then they ferment it for up to 60 days and get over 100 different microbes in that strange brew that you use to either drink directly as a probiotic beverage or distill into a mezcal or a tequila. Agaves use only 1/5 to a half of what conventional crops use to produce the same amount of edible biomass over a decadal duration. So they're really the champions of all of this. And now there's a Billion Agave initiative that we're part of that began in Mexico, that we want to see agaves part of our our million plant tree initiative in Tucson. And Tucson already has more agave species than any city in the world in our nurseries and public spaces. Roughly 130 different species of agaves are out in the Tucson landscape, but very few people know how to use them for food and beverage. And that's why Erin spearheaded this project on desert foods for a resilient future that makes these plants that are all around us accessible as delicious foods and beverages once more. Next image. Oddly, we're doing the Desert Smells Like Rain garden component of the Tumamoc Resilience Gardens for health benefits as well. We found that there's 16 volatile oils that reduce stress by inhalation, like you do after the rains. If these plants are present in gardens, they also offer these aromatic volatile oils that reduce blood pressure, blood, heart pulse, anxiety, depression, and many other factors. And we have a feature article coming out in the next Desert Plants issue about the 60-some aromatic plants that we want to incorporate both into food gardens and fragrant gardens in Tucson as adaptations to climate change. So eaters, it's time that we wake up, just like we're asking Arizona farmers to wake up. We're facing the worst food crisis in 50 years in terms of the water crisis that's hitting agriculture that will inevitably force conventional agriculture to decline in its productivity. But because of COVID, unemployment, and many other factors, we're also seeing the worst food and health crisis for the poorest of the poor in Arizona. And if anything, we want to show that we need an agriculture that reduces the disparities, the tremendous disparities that we have in Arizona today. We've not had a farm and food crisis like this since the 1980s, but we don't want this one to last that long. We don't want farmers to go broke. We want to give them incentives to adapt so that they will be in the black, not in the red, 9 out of every 10 years. And we also want to see water being recharged in our aquifers again, rather than being depleted at rates greater than the rates of water that we're consuming, because all the wildlife and all the plants in Arizona depend on this water as much as we do. And we don't think all of that water should go to humans. And finally, we have to remember that the farmers in our state are going through tremendous economic and ecological stresses right now. If your own access to water or your own annual income was cut by nearly 1/3, you would call that a crisis. In Pima County alone, we're going to see 500 jobs lost just within the next few months, and more as the long-term effects of this dramatic change in Colorado River water rationing take place. And lastly, we have a call to action to you. We need your volunteer hours to help us with this. We need your writing and your photography. We need your financial support to make all the aspects of these Tumamoc resilience gardens bear fruit within the next year or two, so that we don't have to wait another 40 years to have a proof of concept of this. So our call to action is to involve you not only in trying out in your own place tech-driven solutions like micro-irrigation systems and agrivoltaics, but supporting those in our public places like Tumamoc Hill and Biosphere 2. And with the desert crop-driven solutions, we need to see you involved in planting those million agaves that we need in Tucson. We need to see you lobby the US Senate and House to fund a new desert agriculture and climate change adaptation center in Tucson, where we teach farmers and scientists themselves how to move us more quickly towards arid adapted crop production and reduction of the many challenges that are facing us today. So thank you very much, and consider yourself co-designers of these systems. We need your help in every possible way, your intelligence, your artistic skills, your scientific skills, and your goodwill in spreading the word. Thank you.
Gary and Erin, thank you so much for such an insightful and enlightening presentation that, I mean, there is so much there, and I think you both really articulated the multiple elements that were kind of weaving together within not just this physical space, but also this conceptual space, but very importantly, this applied space in terms of the directions we're really, it's not just wanting to, but collectively we need to go in these directions. And also, Gary, I need to get that recipe for that agave and the pineapple ferment there. That looks pretty refreshing. So I want to just take a couple minutes here to have a chance to chat with you both about a couple elements that you mentioned that that I think would be really interesting to explore a little deeper. So the first one I want to delve into is, I know that part of this research and this paper was doing a broad inventory of the possible species that make sense for this model and the species that have been used in this region. And so there's two elements I'm curious if you can explain. First, just talk a little bit about that process of creating the inventory and the list of candidate species that should be considered for this Aridamerica model. And then second, you know, I know that there was a criteria used that some rose to the top within that, and that certain genera were especially relevant and just kind of ready-made for broad use in this scope. If you don't mind just drawing our attention to a couple of those and thought. So I know maybe if Erin, if you want to kick us off in terms of that process, and then and then kind of what species really you keyed in on.
Sure, great question, Ben. You know, we had no shortage of plants to choose from. Essentially, we looked at the plants that have been long used in the Sonoran Desert for thousands of years. And there were a whole suite of different things, from agaves and cacti to leguminous trees to winter and summer annuals. And so really we had an incredible diversity of foods and an incredibly diverse diet to consider when we were thinking about, well, what are some of the plants that could be the epitome of slow agriculture and sustainable foods. We were really mindful of wanting to select species that could really help provide ecosystem benefits, were also helpful for supporting human health, and then finally offered some opportunities for community well-being. And a couple of examples here are things like the prickly pear that Gary mentioned. So that plant, from kind of a ecosystem benefit standpoint, it's incredibly drought hardy. It's a succulent. It doesn't even have leaves. The leaves have been transformed into spines. So actually the spines on cacti that you see are modified leaves to really reduce the water that could be lost from the plant. And then they're able to store water in that succulent tissue. And so they're really well adapted to heat and to drought stress, but they're also incredibly nutritious. So the nopalitos are just packed full of calcium and other vitamins. They also, that slime or that mucilage that actually helps slow down the absorption of sugar. And so it's a great anti-diabetic plant. And then finally, we can just look to Mexico, our neighbor to the south, to see that those plants are incredibly well positioned to be used in agriculture from small to large scale. And so that's just one example. I don't know, Gary, if you'd like to share a few of your other favorites. I know mesquite is at the top of the list.
Well, I want to back up before more examples and say something that I think we all need to make clear, that we're neither selecting the plants in a way that smacks of cultural appropriation or violation of various First Nations seed sovereignty, that we're not talking about tepary beans or maize or even the domesticated prickly pears here. We're really going for the wild species, some of them related to Native American crops, some not, that have 6 million years of adapting to the desert, and dozens of cultures have used them: native, immigrant, Mesoamerican, Aridamerican. In nearly every case, more than a dozen native and immigrant cultures have been utilizing these wild species, but they're not domesticated. We're not talking about patenting or trademarking any of them. We're really trying to focus on not a single miracle crop that can be patented, but a guild of plants that mutually support one another. And almost all of our selections are truly wild. Some have been semi-managed in agroforestry systems, but we're not talking about Native American domesticated crops.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. And you hit on something there that's exactly the next question I had in mind. You both have worked a lot with crop wild relatives, and I wonder if you don't mind just taking a minute to introduce us to that concept, and then talk a little bit about how they fit both into the garden project, but also, broadly speaking, what is the future and the importance of crop wild relatives going forward. And so, well, Erin, maybe if you don't mind starting us off, and then Gary, I'd love you to follow up.
Sure. Well, a crop wild relative is kind of what it sounds like. It's the wild ancestor cousin to our modern day domesticated crops. And, as we've been breeding plants, we tend to focus on things like yield, and we, as a byproduct, breed out hardiness. And if we turn to the close relatives of our crops that are still in the wild, actively coping with challenging growing conditions and co-evolving with pests, that those wild relatives, they're incredibly hardy, and they are in fact a pool of genetic resources of variability that we may be able to breed back into our modern day crops to make them more hardy. And many of these plants could be used in and of themselves, either for food or for other means. Gary, I don't know if you'd like to expand on that.
Yes, I've worked off and on crop wild relatives since the mid-1970s, and the wonderful eye-opening shift that's happened in the last 10 years is that we're no longer thinking of them just as material for plant breeders to improve, say, salt tolerance or protection from high solar radiation. We're talking about using them in many ways other than through plant breeding. One of the most promising ones right now that can really rapidly help farmers of tree and vine crops in the arid West is using hardy rootstock of crop wild relatives that confers most of the real characteristics we want. The fruit characteristics of having a sweet, lovely looking fruit is still what we graft onto that rootstock, but the drought tolerance, heat tolerance, insect tolerance, disease tolerance is all in the rootstock. And so we're looking at doing something that Arizonans have done in the past, once again, using Arizona wild grape with Merlot on it, or other varieties of grapes, of domesticated grapes, of using Arizona walnut as a rootstock for desert adapted varieties of Carpathian walnut and English walnut. So two other uses of them is those direct uses that Erin implied. The chiltepine still goes for more, for higher prices per pound than domesticated chilies do. Sonorans and Arizonans are in love with chiltepines, and they have a place in these systems, as does things like Mexican oregano. But we also have other crop wild relatives like the buffalo gourds that can be used as a trap crop in integrated pest management systems to keep cucumber beetles and other pests from overwhelming the foliage of the planted areas. You plant these on the margins of fields and the pests move over to them and don't damage the crops.
I love those examples.
I'll just jump in real quick and say that, here in the Sonora Desert, Arizona, we are really in a hot spot of diversity for these crop wild relatives. And so it's a great motivator for conservation, and a great sense of pride that we could have in our own wild plants here and their role for a more resilient future.
That's exactly right. Something that both of you have really opened my eyes to is just how disproportionately rich the Borderlands region is in these species that the close relatives of so many of our domesticated crop species at the global scale. So many of them are really, their roots are here. Speaking of the rootstock you talked about, Gary. Another thing I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you about is, Gary, you mentioned, I think it's so well put, that we're viewing the Tumamoc garden as these pilot sites, this proof of concept, these these initial nodes, as I'm calling them, to really communicate out and draw people in terms of this larger shift in how we think about our food systems. One other site that you mentioned the Ajo site, which I can't wait to go revisit. But Gary, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about the work you're doing with the CONCAC and the agrivoltaics work you're doing there, but there's so many layers to that in terms of, maybe you may even want to mention the seagrass element with the EAS or the Zostra. But I think so much of this that we're talking about is also being activated in working with the CONCAC indigenous community that we work a lot with.
Yeah, thank you. I think when I talk about proof of concept, I'm not just talking about can we build it, but who will benefit from it. Yeah. And if we want an agriculture that reduces disparities rather than exacerbates them, some of those proof of concept demonstration plots have to be in some of the poorest communities in the desert to see whether they're acceptable, whether their nutritional benefits actually help people with the dawning health challenges that they're facing, and are dealing with the people who are not typically just at the end of the line, but beyond the end of the line in getting the benefits of science, modern science. And so we're a finalist for a project University of Arizona with University of Sonora, the CIAD Research Institute in Hermosillo, and the CESE Institute in Ensenada to help the SERI communities and their young, brilliant new leadership go totally solar, get off the grid because they were cut off because of the debt that they accrued over the COVID pandemic 18 months that we've already faced from water and energy. So they were buying water at $6 a gallon or bucket and using propane to heat their food. We're doing large solar arrays with gardens under them on the upward sides of the village so that they will also not be flooded out by ocean level rising. Another thing that all indigenous peoples along coasts are facing. And we've begun with Eric Mesa, who is with the food bank and now with CR Club, and Gerardo Ruiz Smith, permaculture workshops in both villages, distributing perennial plants that then will ramp up another level in the agrivoltaic systems that will be like community gardens at the edge of the villages, and other ones in the 30-some family solar collectors that people are already growing food under in one of the villages. So the point is to track how this affects their health, their water use, their energy and water costs, and their overall economic well-being over the next 5 to 10 years.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I guess one last question for each of you. I could ask a dozen more, but in an eye towards time, what for each of you are you hoping people connect to or come away with after visiting the Tumamoc Resilience Garden? And that can be at any point in time within the Resilience Garden. I mean, that can be in a matter of months when we first breaking ground. It can be 5 years from now. I'm curious because it's going to be a changing space. That's one of the things I'm most excited about with this garden, is that each of us who are going to be interacting with it are going to be developing a relationship with it and see it change through time, and to hopefully learn through time. So, Erin, let's start with you. What would your answer to that question be?
Yeah, I'm really excited about Tumamoc being the location for these gardens, and just how accessible that is for so many people. And I would love for people to really feel like they are involved in the solution for how do we live and feed ourselves in a hotter and drier world. I want people to walk away feeling like they have a sense of inspiration that I could do this in my own garden, and there's a community of other like-minded folks or people or resources that I am connected with that I can do this together with. And if I have an idea, that I can share that and really be part of this process.
Fantastic. Yeah, and Gary, what are you hoping people come away with?
That was just a wonderful answer, Erin. I have to say that it really inspires me. You know what, when we did a program 2 years ago, Ben, about the Nature of Desert Nature book, one thing that rallied us all together is that we want to change that view of deserts of being a place that is lacking. Its whole definition is negative, what it doesn't have, to deserts being valued for what they have that no other place has, including this notion that both you've mentioned, that we're a laboratory of the future for the conditions so we can either barely survive in or we can thrive in, depending on how we face those new conditions in a climate change world. But at the second level, all the work that have been done by so many of our nonprofits and universities and colleges in the Sonoran Desert towards community building and making desert cities a better place, or the city of gastronomy and all of that. My biggest wish is that everyone who listens to this think of themselves as co-designers of a new desert food future. That the notions of collaborative design, that one of you could walk by and say, crap, I can figure it out a better way to harvest water off a solar panel than what Greg and Gary have figured it out. Can I join your team? That you may think of some other plants that grow better under the understories of that solar collector than stevia and wolfberries and Mexican oregano and chiltepines than what we have thought of. That you might think about the configuration of the trees and the understory plants in a more artistic way than we have. All of your talents and skills are needed, not just by this project, but our community as a whole, because our future will not look like or taste like what it has in the past. And we need to have a collective vision to make it the wonderful place that it should be, where disparities disappear rather than becoming aggravated.
You're here. Thank you for that. Thank you both so much for your time. Such a beautiful kickoff to this series, and so well encapsulated in everything we're trying to accomplish with this garden space and with so much more. So thank you all for tuning in and joining us for this first input into this series. Please feel free to digest these series either by watching the video, listening to the audio file, downloading the audio file, listening to it as a podcast as you're going from point A to point B, and hopefully we'll be able to reconvene in person in the not too distant future. Until then, thank you so much. Everyone be well. And Gary and Erin, thank you again.
Gratitude to you all.
Yes, thank you so much.